Hello, everyone. This is the latest episode of the Fabric Spotlight series, a series of talks with enterprise CXOs and infrastructure executives. With our guests, we discuss industry trends and cover cloud infrastructure and enterprise topics. Today, I'm excited to have a chat with Vishy Gopalakrishnan, Vice President Transformation at AT&T. In this executive role, Vishy is responsible for leading initiatives to drive IT transformation strategy utilizing SaaS and cloud. Welcome, Vishy, and thanks for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you, Rajan. Glad to be here.
So, Vishy, we have known each other for a while. We have spoken with you in different avatars at AT&T. Before we talk about your role at AT&T itself and your current initiatives, could you share a bit of your journey to here?
Absolutely. So I think my journey is a bit, what I would say, convoluted. My kind of formal background is in computer science. I have a bachelor's and master's in computer science. When was in my master's program, I developed a keen interest in artificial intelligence. And so my master's thesis ended up being in kind of evaluating algorithms for reasoning under uncertainty. So it had to do a lot with Bayes' theorem and Bayesian belief networks. And I had grand plans to go into research and then academia. But then this was, you can probably tell by the color of my hair that was in the distant past. It happened to coincide with one of the many AI winters. And so I had to find the kind of most expedient thing as an immigrant was to go find a job. So as luck has it, I ended up actually working with what is now the Earth Institute at Columbia University. One of the most kind of fascinating parts of my career, where I got to work at the intersection of social science, the kind of the natural sciences and information science. And it was all about taking remote sensing data that comes from NASA satellites, so taking a bunch of geospatial data, making those data sets available and consumable by research scientists across a variety of disciplines. Researchers who are interested in mapping population growth with what the remote sensing data is telling you in terms of what's happening with urban areas, what's happening with, say, quality of the soil, what's happening with the course of waterways in the United States, etc. And so it was basically dealing with big data before big data was a thing, right? And before the advent of cloud. I spent some time there. Then I had a similar role. I worked at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, kind of doing similar stuff, except focused primarily on epidemiology, longitudinal studies around diseases. One of the things that University of Michigan School of Public Health specialized in was around the effects of smoking on long-term health. So large data sets, large time series data, how do you work with all of that? So helping these researchers with the kind of the compute infrastructure required to solve these problems. And kind of since then, I've had a variety of different roles. I worked for a while at Motorola in their cellular infrastructure group. So I had the fortune of participating in the transition of cellular when it went from primarily being a very hardware-oriented environment to software. And just as the US was transitioning from analog to digital as well. So that was a huge kind of shift. I spent about a decade after that in consulting. I worked at Ernst & Consulting, doing a lot of what I would call CIO agenda consulting around IT operations, IT portfolio management. Did some merger integration work when Capgemini bought Ernst & Consulting. And since then, I've tried my own business, tried my own consulting company focused on mobile apps and mobile security for a while. I've had the opportunity to work at SAP in their mobile solutions business, leading a go-to-market team focused on landing customers globally for SAP. And then I've had a variety of roles at AT&T, including product management, corporate strategy. I led all of AT&T's innovation programs worldwide, which included managing 6 innovation centers, 4 in the US, 1 in Tel Aviv, Israel, and 1 in Mexico City. And now I'm in this role where I'm leading a major technology transformation program. So not what you would think of as a very kind of linear kind of career path.
It's a very eclectic background and actually quite fascinating, given it is Earth Day and starting
Yeah,
off in that domain, quite appropriate for the times,
right,
actually.
right.
Um, and when I met you, you were leading the innovation labs, if I remember. And
Right,
now
right,
you are leading the digital transformation or IT transformation.
right.
Um, what would you say excites you most in this IT transformation journey? What are the key initiatives and innovations that you're focused on?
Yeah, Rajan, just to give you some context, AT&T is a company that's been around for about 140 plus years, right? It goes back to the days of Alexander Graham Bell. We have, as an organization, accumulated a bunch of IT assets, which, to put it mildly, show their age, right? And like a lot of large enterprises that I'm sure you deal with, uh, there are IT systems and IT infrastructure of varying vintages. So a big part of this kind of multi-year transformation, part that is most exciting, is uh, how do you kind of keep two contrasting things in your mind? One is the scale of the problem is huge. We are a $170 billion company from a revenue perspective. So you have to make sure that uh, you the business cannot miss a beat, but at the same time you have to kind of manage a technology transformation. And so it's the scale of the problem can be intimidating. What I find most exciting is that the need to keep that in the back of your mind, but not be overwhelmed by it. Uh, and a lot of things that you think will work at scale from a technical perspective absolutely apply, but AT&T has its own kind of scale. We're a Fortune 10 company, so that's number one. Number two, since we're large, a significant part of the transformation that excites me, there is a technology element that excites me, but more than that, it is getting the kind of the organization to kind of rally around the change. Because the reality is that if this transformation had been easy, it would have been done by now, right? And you and I've talked about this. There is no paucity of innovative capabilities, innovative companies, and innovative technologies. It is about the application of those capabilities in essentially a brownfield enterprise environment, and then getting essentially a very large group of seasoned IT practitioners within the company to embrace new technologies, which basically is new ways of working. So to me, it's the scale and the fact that there is a human element that you need to pay attention to as part of this transformation. Because if you don't, then the transformation that you drive is not going to be sustainable. And so you may get some short, bursts of some improvement, some amazing capabilities, but how do you ensure that you can sustain the transformation so those new ways of working that these new technologies allow you to kind of capitalize on essentially become part of the bloodstream?
Absolutely. In fact, probably AT&T is the oldest organization or a person from an oldest organization that I'm chatting with. It's quite fascinating. And I'm sure there's a lot of legacy infrastructure that you have to carry and transform with you. And talk about rapidly advancing forward from a 140-year-old company to adopt the cloud, which is the latest in the infrastructure
Mm-hmm.
space. And
Mm-hmm.
what are the key areas of cloud adoption that you're involved with, your opinions on, and how does it impact what you're doing?
Absolutely. Um, so if you think about, like, we literally have multiple thousands of applications around our entire IT ecosystem, and they span anything and everything from all of the traditional business capabilities you can think about, from customer acquisition to all the customer lifecycle management around a variety of different businesses that we're in. So from a consumer perspective, we are obviously in the wireless and mobility business. Then we are also in the broadband fiber business. We are also in the kind of the streaming business with HBO Max. We also have a pretty sizable enterprise or B2B business. And so if you think about just from a satisfying that the customer and servicing the customer, delivering the services, acquiring customers, servicing the customers, and then kind of, like ongoing loyalty, upsell, cross-sell. There's a variety of applications. As part of our transformation, we've decided to go public cloud first. So you're talking about multiple thousands of applications that have to be migrated to the cloud. At the same time, we're also saying, there are opportunities to replace clusters of applications within our ecosystem with just, SaaS offerings. Two just come to mind. We've made a big decision to pivot a significant part of our, let's just call it CRM, customer 360 kind of capabilities across our corporation on Salesforce, right? So there's a big chunk of applications that are going to go into Salesforce. Similar when it comes to things around ITSM, ITOM, ITAM, we've decided to consolidate a lot of kind of homegrown and customized apps onto ServiceNow platform, right? And there's lots of kind of opportunities to do that. But there are still a lot of applications that we have that we've built homegrown that we're in the process of migrating to the cloud. Some of the principles that we are using to drive this is not just migrating, but we are using this opportunity to actually shut down or retire a bunch of applications. Because the reality is across multiple thousands of applications and the scale of our kind of IT environment, we are using this opportunity to actually shoot a bunch of applications. We are being very diligent about which ones we take out, but we definitely have a target in terms of how many applications we need to end up with over a 3-year period. So there's a very deliberate focus on just shutting down a bunch of apps. At the same time, we also realize that given the environment in which we operate, and we operate in a very heavily regulated environment, so there are aspects of our application portfolio which, for a variety of reasons, we may decide from a risk perspective that we want to keep a small set of those applications in our own data centers. So managing this and orchestrating, the migration of a selected set of apps into public cloud, at the same time, another set of applications being replaced by SaaS, and then retiring a bunch of applications, and then reducing our data center footprint to a very small number and moving some very specific apps to that data center. That's kind of the totality of our kind of application migration program.
Wow. That's staggering in the scale of what you're trying to accomplish. I'm sure there must be a lot of challenges. And before we get down into the weeds, I'm sure there's a lot of issues that you have to tackle as you either migrate to the cloud or hold some things in the data center. Security must be a natural part of the consideration. And so how are you approaching the cloud security issues as you look at all of these? It must be playing a major role, especially within a regulated environment like yours.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we are fortunate that we have an amazing team under our chief security officer who, come with a tremendous amount of experience because, if you think about what our CSO team has to do, they're also protecting our infrastructure. So if you're an AT&T customer, if you use AT&T for your wireless service, our CSO team also has to protect our mobile core, our RAN network, etc., right, from malicious actors. Whether they are nation-state actors or non-nation state actors as well. Right? So plus, they also have to kind of manage all of the applications within our environment as well. So between our team that is driving from an engineering perspective how we migrate to the cloud and our chief security officer team, we've laid out a set of principles, right, around how we look at security in the cloud. And for the most part, it is a lot of principles still hold, but some of the kind of our stance around security has to evolve in terms of how we deal with data at rest, data in motion, the fact that we will, by definition, just because of the way I laid out the transformation, we will have applications in the public cloud, SaaS clouds, our own on-prem data center as well. And so as data moves around these applications, how do we make sure that I like to think of as applications become more promiscuous and they talk to each other in a variety of different ways that is difficult to test sometimes in all of the permutations and combinations. What kinds of controls can you put at different layers of the stack? What kinds of things can you insert into the developer toolkit so that as you're putting things into production, you at least have a modicum of rigor in terms of flagging the most obvious things. So we used to, we do a lot of code scanning, as part of our developer tool chain. How do those need to evolve as we get into the cloud? We are obviously, a networking company. So we know a thing or two about how to kind of secure the network connectivity. But we spend a lot of time making sure that our dev teams get the right kind of training, because operating in the cloud is slightly different. But I think we've kind of landed in a place where there is a reasonable kind of degree of understanding across the company, and a reasonable degree of what I would say assurance between the controls that our CSO team has put together, the tooling that we have on how we can advance this. Now, can it all get better? Yes. Can you, because it is an ongoing battle, as I'm sure, Rajan, you can attest to. But I think we are at a decent place. We obviously also have to make sure that whatever we do, we abide by also the privacy requirements from a regulatory perspective that we have to adhere to. So whether it's how we manage PII, how we make sure that, for example, our call center agents, as they're dealing with PII, we're also subject to PCI requirements in our point of sale systems, et cetera. So managing that entire kind of, Rubik's Cube is something that we have an amazing team of people who kind of try to boil all of that down and make it available as tooling and some kind of process framework to make it all happen at the scale that we need to.
In addition to security, you talked about migrating existing applications to the cloud. Besides some of them SaaS, you're also migrating applications to the cloud. Probably new applications are also being developed as a part of this transformation. And I presume, given the fact that Kubernetes is being adopted in a major way in the industry, you must also be doing the same thing. But I want to get your perspective, how it is it being adopted? What is the role that it plays, and how do you automate or manage such environments?
Yeah, so Rajan, we, over the last, I would say, kind of pretty much in line with the broader industry, there was, if you were to take a time frame, say the last 5 years or so, there were a fair number of new applications that we were building that were getting containerized. And then over a period of time, they were built, we were using Kubernetes, and we built our own internal kind of framework that integrated anything and everything from Jenkins or code scanning, how we manage our Kubernetes environment for on-prem, right? But now, as we are going into public cloud, our default position right now is what comes as the Kubernetes offering from the public cloud vendor, right? So that's our starting point. There's obviously things, you and I have talked about this in terms of, given the scale and the scope of our applications, as we go into more and more Kubernetes environments in the public cloud, we're always on the lookout for tools from an observability perspective that help our operations teams with getting insight into what is going on. Because I think there are capabilities that we believe that the Kubernetes services from public cloud vendors provide, but I think there's still room. So that's an area of kind of active investigation for our teams as well. So we have a tremendous amount of expertise doing Kubernetes on-prem. but now transitioning to whether it's AKS in Azure, right? How do we do that? And how do we make sure that because I'll just kind of rewind a little bit. One of the things that we have to kind of confront with is, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of enterprises you talk to as well, Rajan, is DevOps as a concept. Everybody will nod their head and say, yes, 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 DevOps. But I think, how do you make sure that as an organization at the scale at which we are, as we transition into a heavily cloud-first company, the transition to DevOps is a tricky one. So what is the right set of tooling we need to provide around visibility, observability, troubleshooting, et cetera, so we don't end up with, I call them, the triage call from hell, where you spend 4 or 5 hours trying to figure out exactly what broke where, because you don't have the kind of granularity across, not just kind of across the stack, but east-west as well. And driving that, and we're trying to use this opportunity as we migrate to the cloud to drive a consistent way to put in place some standards around what I would call, logs, metrics, traces, so that kind of as we go into the cloud, we have some of these basic building blocks in place. So we are very mindful of the ops side of DevOps as well. And it's not an afterthought.
That's fascinating. One of the things, Vishy, in the Kubernetes world, it encourages is use of open source components as a part of the tooling. Do you have an opinion in that space, and how much do you leverage the open source components to versus what are the components that are provided by the cloud service providers?
We, we've historically have been very active users and contributors to the open source environment. So there are significant chunks of our environment where we leverage open source all the time. As we go to the cloud, what are the kind of the capabilities that the cloud provider provides us? We are always looking for what other capabilities open source can add on top of it. So we have a very open mind, and in fact, we have some preferences on what kinds of open source, either specific tooling on whether it's open source initiatives like OpenTelemetry, et cetera, that we have very specific points of view on. So even when we evaluate whether it's just pure open source or open source plus, which is businesses that take an open source stack and wrap services around them, we have specific points of view on that, right? Specifically when it comes to things like like I said, OpenTelemetry, how vendors are looking at what kind of collectors they allow us to build in an observability environment. We are big users of, for example, Kafka. So we look at vendors who can support that kind of infrastructure as well. So long story short, there is no kind of easy button in terms of this open source, this from the like the public cloud vendor. But we're always looking for capabilities, and there is a tremendous amount of active investigation all the time within our teams on a bunch of different open source capabilities. And there's a pretty rich history of kind of, I would say, mix and match of commercial and open source software within the company. And so that's a muscle that's fairly familiar and kind of well exercised within the company.
In addition to the cloud side of things, there is a tremendous movement towards using the edge. And in that context, edge cloud, edge services, 5G, how do you see that transformation happening? Obviously, AT&T is potentially a leader in the space. What kind of innovations do you see out there in this area?
So I had the privilege to actually have a front row seat to a tremendous amount of innovation around edge in my prior role, because we spent a lot of time trying to understand at the intersection of 5G and edge, what kinds of applications and services and business model innovations exist out there. Just to quickly recap, so the three areas we kind of looked at that time, we said, okay, there is obviously the opportunity from a consumer perspective to essentially untether the kind of the AR VR environment. So you can actually get desktop or PC quality XR experiences in an untethered environment using 5G and Edge. The second area that we looked at was around sensor fusion, right? So whether it's in a smart city environment, whether you have cameras, whether you have other kinds of sensors that kind of dot a metropolitan area, how do you use edge computing to do things like very opportunistic kind of inferencing at the edge? So you don't have to transition an entire kind of network all the way back to the inferencing, especially in a scenario in which the ability to do inferencing and make a decision from a business process perspective, that latency is actually very short. And it is super critical that you actually make an inference and make a decision in a very short period of time. So that was the second area. The third one was looking at broadly the autonomous vehicle space and looking at how do you use edge computing to enable the creation and delivery of HD maps, which provide kind of centimeter level accuracy. Because if you kind of fast forward where you have a fleet of AVs in an environment, how do you make sure that you don't necessarily have a data center stuck in the back of your car for an AV to come to life, right? So how do you use edge where you can push logically the compute as close to where the AVs are, but not necessarily have them be in the AV? Because once you put the data center in the AV, you just jacked up the bill of materials for the autonomous vehicle, right? Yep. So how, and then all kinds of engineering issues around kind of maintenance, et cetera. So we see a tremendous amount of opportunity on the consumer side in terms of immersive experiences, whether it's at stadiums, at homes, et cetera, or in kind of, parks. But there's a tremendous amount of opportunity even in the enterprise space. So whether it's the use of edge on factory floors, to do inferencing, whether it's around things like safety and inspection on factory floors, whether it's the opportunity to apply vision, computer vision, image recognition, but be able to do all of that by locating the inferencing compute and the inferencing capability much closer to the edge in the factory floor or in a closet on the factory floor, and allow decisions to be made in much, much, much faster times as well. So that's where we see the opportunities around edge. We obviously, as a network provider, we see opportunities for us to participate in the edge economy, but we also see opportunities for our customers and our consumers with edge as well. Does that answer your question, Rajan?
It does. Actually, it opens up a whole range of fascinating topics that we could probably spend an hour discussing around this area. But one of the things that if you can briefly address, we see the fact that we can improve the quality of experience, especially in this day of enterprise workers now becoming mobile workers, being scattered all over. And how do you see the edge being leveraged, or do you see the edge being leveraged to improve the quality of experience for these mobile workers as they work probably not from the most ideal enterprise type environment? Maybe they are in India, maybe they are in somewhere else in the world, given the fact where you are, having to travel in these times, or working from home where probably their kids are playing games on their Wi-Fi and killing the productivity.
Yeah. So I think, Rajan, that's an interesting question, because I think a lot of folks that I talk to get caught up in a particular definition of the edge as a very specific place, right? And the reality is the edge can be anywhere, right? And in this particular kind of use case we're talking about, I see the edge basically being the employee and the compute environment that the employee has. So my laptop, for example, connected to the Wi-Fi that I have, that's connected to my broadband at home. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for solving the following problem. You from your experience firsthand with SD-WAN, I think, in some sense, there's an opportunity to almost create I would call it a hyper-personalized version of SD-WAN. So, I mean, because if we think about it, if you're an organization of 10,000 employees, the reality is that the pandemic, for the most part, has now created the following problem for the CIO, is that the network is not known specific buildings or locations where you can engineer the network for and you control it. Now it's almost as if there are 10,000 very discrete and disparate networks over which you have absolutely no control, right? So I believe there's an opportunity for solutions that solve the problem for the CIO and the CSO. Let's not forget the CSO as well. From the perspective of how do I make sure that regardless of the quality of broadband that I have at home, the kind of contention that I'm experiencing through the course of my working day, whether it's kids doing virtual learning, playing on the Xbox, etc., or maybe a spouse or a significant other who also happens to be working from home at the same time and happens to be on a Zoom video call like this, how do you make sure that in the least intrusive manner to that employee, I still provide them as close to an office experience in the kind of the physical office experience at home, while mediating for the quality of the broadband, which, like I said, if you have 10,000 employees, they're not all identical in terms of the quality of the broadband and the traffic that they have on the local Wi-Fi network. And I think anything that mediates around that and gives the CIO the assurance that even though my employees are kind of distributed throughout the globe, I can still give them a great quality of experience. And can I do that for, most of the apps that my employees might use? So whether it's, the combination of collaboration software, whether it's, video conferencing, Office 365, whether it's other SaaS providers, etc. And can you optimize and tweak for that? So in some sense, Rajan, it's like taking the lessons of SD-WAN, right? And then kind of solving that for the individual worker at home.
So Vishy, one other area where we are focused on is IoT. Mm-hmm. What is your view of industrial IoT, the security issues associated with it, and also the secure remote access to the IoT devices with respect to the critical infrastructure these days?
Yeah, Rajan, IoT has been an area that's been, in the news for a long time. But I think now what we're finding out is that increasingly more and more of businesses and business processes are getting instrumented with sensors. But more importantly, the data that's being gathered from these sensors is being analyzed, and with all of the tools that can be pointed at them in terms of analyzing the data, whether it's utilizing the latest AI and ML techniques, now allows the businesses to kind of generate a whole lot of insights, whether it's in terms of just pure operational efficiencies and how you might operate a particular piece of machinery on a factory floor, or whether you use it for better customer experiences when it comes to, say, in a real estate environment, in a corporate building, around how you use energy efficiently using building control systems. I think one of the challenges that is still out there, in my opinion, is how do you bring together what have historically and still in a lot of organizations tend to be two relatively independent and in a lot of cases siloed pieces of infrastructure around just IT, just the conventional IT endpoints, if you will, laptops, routers, firewalls, load balancers, etc. But then the whole OT side of the house, operational technology. So all of the sensors that might sit on the manufacturing floor, that might be part of your entire kind of supply chain monitoring infrastructure, etc. How do you bring those two together in a relatively seamless fashion? And to me, bringing that together involves paying attention to, a lot of disciplines that on the conventional IT side, we've matured over multiple decades in terms of the provisioning of IT endpoints, in terms of the ongoing life cycle, in terms of from a security posture, the threat detection and the response to what's happening with these endpoints on the IT side. How do you bring those capabilities within the same frameworks and tools and processes to the OT side of the house? So there are tools that allow you to do that on the OT side of the house, but can you bring them together in a relatively seamless fashion so that if you are the CIO and CSO for an enterprise, how can you actually make sure that you have a relatively consistent way of managing these assets, right? So in some sense, your tooling and your processes and your operating model for managing these assets, if we can get to a point where that is agnostic to the actual endpoint being managed, right? Whether it's a piece of surveillance equipment on a factory floor or whether it's an employee's laptop, how do you make sure that you can manage them using the same set of tools? And I think that's the other challenge. And then bringing together all of the, like I said, vulnerability, threat management, all of those capabilities for the OT side, bring that into the IT side as well.
Got it. Got it. So, Vishy, we have had a very, very good conversation so far, and your background has been quite varied from where you started to where you are today, and you've spanned the roles of an entrepreneur, a vendor, and an IT executive. Any insights into how your perspective on IT infrastructure has evolved over these different viewpoints?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the roles that you talked about that I've had the kind of pleasure and privilege of kind of being in over the last several years have also coincided with how kind of just IT architecture has evolved broadly. Client server to 3-tier, then cloud, and now with edge. So I think my perspective has very much been informed also by how architecture has evolved, what essentially cloud has done to infrastructure itself, and what it continues to do. I think in a lot of these roles, I think one thing that has definitely changed and evolved is how much the kind of attention we paid to infrastructure. So whether it was compute, storage, network, etc., as to the amount of effort in terms of engineering the infrastructure and the specialized attention that you had to pay. So this is almost like an infrastructure, the metaphor of the transition from pets to cattle, and the ability to kind of say, all infrastructure needs to be, immutable. You should be able to spin up, spin down whenever you want. Your infrastructure fabric should be able to tolerate failures in one part of an infrastructure, and evolving to infrastructure as code. What that means for teams within IT organizations that manage infrastructure, and how that has also changed the relationship between what used to be historically, the infrastructure side of the house sits here and the application team sits here. And in some sense, never the twain shall meet. And I think the other thing that I have seen is that now, with the evolution of essentially cloud, infrastructure as code, DevOps, I think enterprises are having to figure out how you actually blur those lines, make these organizations come together. And so how does tooling need to evolve? And more importantly, from a people perspective, the practitioners on both sides of the house, in some sense, the dev side and the ops side, they can actually talk to each other and work together in a very, very effective manner.
Yeah, I know. The most fascinating thing is the evolution of the role of the DevOps as the infrastructure characteristics have changed. Mm-hmm. As to some parting advice for our entrepreneurs, you've had mm-hmm. great successes. You've been exposed to multiple startups. You yourself have done your own entrepreneurial gig. Any advice for them? Any advice how they would interact with, let's say, a large company like AT&T,
Right.
Any shared thoughts?
Thank you for asking that, Rajan. I can just share, I would say, just maybe a few questions to ask yourself. To your earlier comment when you asked the question, I've been on both sides. I've been an entrepreneur myself, and then I'm in this role. I'd say this may be again stating the blindingly obvious, but I think it's super important. Enterprises like AT&T and a vast majority of enterprises that have been around for any length of time are brownfields. So there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure, applications, ways of working, organizational models already in place. And so if you're an entrepreneur who has come up with an amazing idea that has, say, 10x the price performance, 5x better customer experience, etc., I think those are all necessary, but they're not sufficient to carry the day, right? How does your innovation, your secret sauce, make its way into the existing enterprise landscape for that particular customer? And I think paying attention to that, being mindful of that, and realizing that, yes, you are bringing something pretty unique to the table, but the customer on the other side of the table has to figure out what is, in some sense, the minimally invasive way for that new innovative capability to make its way into the organization. And so paying attention to that part of the equation and trying to help your customer navigate through that. People are thirsting, are looking for new innovative solutions, but they're also looking for your guidance and counsel as an entrepreneur to say, how does this enter into the orbit of the existing kind of IT organization? What kinds of challenges will this new technology solve? But more importantly, how will it make its entry? Because the reality is most large organizations, including like ours, have existing businesses to run, mission critical applications to support. So how do you manage this duality of there's an existing business to run, but you're trying to introduce something very new? And how do you do that very carefully? So in some sense, I equate it to like a ballet. So how do you actually help the customer kind of perform that ballet most gracefully?
Nice. This is the first time I've heard that analogy, Vishy, to the
Yeah.
ballet. So
Yeah.
thanks very much for a insightful talk. And thanks, everyone. And stay tuned for another Fabric Spotlight series.